Okay, well first, I just want to take a moment to say thank you everyone. This is really a tremendous day. And the audience receptivity and participation in this day has been tremendous, and just really a beautiful co-creation. Really glad that we get just this last few moments together to share and to see what wants to rise to the surface. So this question, open. How can we honor inclusion of risk takers who have fallen victim to the drug war, but are prevented from entering the legal practitioner system due to licensing? Someone who'd like to take that?
Hello? I got to talk really close to the mic, but so I don't have a great answer for that, but my experience in the cannabis field in the state of New York was that those who fell victim, who were criminalized for operating in the cannabis industry, there was a cutout that created opportunities for them. So there's a real life cost to sort of regressive laws that punish people for this, and there should be real life practical benefit. I think we can honor people in name and we can honor them different ways. I think we should honor them in resources and recognizing that the suffering they had should be countered with policy that offers them benefit.
Anyone else want to take that?
I might throw in, there's a challenge here because it goes back to honoring people's illicit activities while they're still illicit. And I think back to like The Secret Chief, if you're familiar with that book, where how can we encapsulate, learn from, and honor while still protecting, because people still need protection right now. And then how can we anticipate an ecosystem where they won't need that protection, where we can actually more full-throatedly support them. And so I think about it when we have as with APA builds membership, we have this capacity to build a lineage tree for the first time, but that can't be public yet, right? So we can't yet build that. But I think there's a lot of thought processes for how we go about honoring many lineages of practice, but I don't think we're there yet to be able to do that. Just my read of the law of the land right now. But I do think that if we have that intention and we're waiting and we're advocating for these laws to change, then comes the opportunity to more publicly build these lineage trees, and then we can really celebrate the heroes of this movement.
Okay. For Roberto, are there Latino public advocates like what Terence McKenna did for the US? What can be done to introduce more non-white figureheads? And maybe we can start with Roberto, and maybe others might want to add to that.
Okay. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. Are there Latino public advocates like Terence McKenna, like the Latino version of Terence McKenna? Are there folks like that? And what can be done to introduce more non-white figureheads into the movement, into view?
First, I'd interrogate the idea of figureheads. I think we should talk about social movements, and then the leaders that come out of social movements then have a legitimacy and a power that is lacking in our public discourse about politics in the United States, which is centered on individuals. So, I really, are there, I mean, like people ask, like, hey, when's the next Latino Cesar Chavez? And I'm like, okay, well, he was kind of center-right. He was anti-immigrant. Hate to tell people, him and Dolores Huerta were denouncing. Look it up. You can Google it right now as we speak. It's there. Look up Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and wetbacks. You'll see the language and the racism that's being used. So, like, I think the way to counter these things is to build the movements, and the leaders will pop out of that. Whether or not the media, my peers in the media will cover it, is another story. Can I say something about the media, real quick?
About what?
I'm a journalist, so like, the role of the media is to partly to raise these things, but we have a real problem in, like, take for example Latin America in reporting on, like, I spend a lot of time in mass graves across the Americas. Because I see the workings of anti-democratic tendencies and trauma in these mass graves. And I see, and I'll go, okay, when you read the news, the dominant narratives of who the oppressors in the Americas are, who? Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, right? But when you look at Latin America through the lens of mass graves, the leaders are not, you know how many there are in Venezuela? 0. How many are there in Cuba? 0. How many are there in Bolivia? We don't know. But how many are there in Mexico? The whole land is pocked with mass graves. Many of them grew exponentially during the Obama era, expanded up to the present. And the reporting, speaking of raising up, raises up Venezuela, and you expect for mass graves to be, those to be the champions. But this one town in Mexico I went to, Iguala. Anybody know about Iguala? You remember those 43 students that were disappeared by drug war funded and trained military, police, and security forces? This one town, when they went looking for the 43 students, they found a mass grave. No, they're not in there. They went to another one. No, there's not in there. Dozens, over a dozen mass graves in this one little town in Mexico. They didn't find the students, but they did find a fact that I like to bring up and raise up like a leader. Like, this one town in Mexico has more mass graves than all of Venezuela, all of Cuba, all of Bolivia, all of Nicaragua combined. This is how much you're living in the matrix. And so anyway, I don't want to, sorry.
Thank you. Shifting to, well, we're on the topic of ethics. Who shapes the ethics around psychedelic therapies? And are people of color's views mirrored in those ethics? So that is an open question.
I can speak to that, how we're going about that with APA, and I can speak to the last question too, which is more pragmatically, if you want more BIPOC representation, pay them. We do in our board, if we want expertise and how to help communities, that requires honoring people, and sometimes that means economic honoring. As we build ethics, if you remember from our governance structure, we have 3 main organizations: an ethics board, a Jedi board, and an elder board. And what we've gone about doing is collected a lot of the ethical guidelines that have been published from different organizations, looking for the cohesion between them, and crafting together some level of a coherent narrative, and then we pass it along to these other pillar organizations within our structure. And then once that's ready for, gone through all these different committees to lay eyes on that, then we put it up to the public for public feedback for months. And then we figure out a way to say, well, how often do we need to update this based on how these look in practice? Because ethical guidelines are practical documents meant to safeguard the humans that we try to help. And so this is our best guess, version 1, 2 years of data collection and reports of harm doing, et cetera. And then we say, okay, time for version 2, and it goes through the same process. All eyes on this, all the different lights coming to the table. And so by having our Jedi team be so central to our governance, it ensures that we have eyes on that at all times. And then by having that second layer, because we all have blind spots for public feedback, that's one of the pragmatic ways we go about it. But what we do in APA is we do have, I can't say it's paying people what they're worth, because it's not, but it's, we are able to pay people who come in with expertise for marginalized community care to weigh in on our policies because it's that important. So if someone's coming in either with a financial hardship or an expertise, we have raised enough money to be able to pay people for their time to help us do this right.
Okay, so there's a few questions about this, so I'm going to try to encapsulate it in one. There are companies, I'll say such as MAPS, that are doing great work for creating pathways for access, but they also, many of these companies also take money from some of the people mentioned in Roberto's talk. So I think that's a question for everybody. How do we reconcile that situation? Would anyone like to speak to that?
That's a pretty big question, and I don't know if we all have the answer to that, because it's not just this field, by the way. So aside, as a member of the New York State Assembly, this is a big part of my legislative priorities. Another part is the environment. So I hold a bill called the Great Lakes Bill of Rights. And it's interesting, in the state of New York, many environmental organizations are actually funded by polluters, and the system actually sets it up that way. So polluters are allowed to dump X amount of pollution into the water, and some of that money then goes to environmental groups. So how do you create a structure where you sever that in this environment, right? I don't think there's an easy or quick answer for that in a capitalist environment, and where it's power, right? So there's just a structure of power and resources, and how do you accomplish your goals while completely separating yourself from that? I think it's a really difficult one, but I just don't think it's a this field thing. It's everything. So I just think it's a great question. I just think there's no great answer, because it goes so far beyond, I think, what we're trying to accomplish here. That's my thought.
Did anyone else want to speak to that? No? Okay. Well,
No, I just think, yeah, we do live in a capitalist system, but large numbers of young people are now identifying as socialists. That's a godsend. They reject the catastrophe of climate change, the catastrophe of exploitation of workers, the catastrophe of the destruction of entire communities. And so it's time to dust off and your radical imagination and the piggyback of your radical imagination. You have to imagine something better, and you have to act and take direct action. If you build the social movement, the politicians, the corporations, the nonprofits will start tilting in another direction, but you need a counterpower. If you don't build the counterpower by organizing, education, direct action, you're doomed.
I just one last point, because my brother's comment down at the bottom there. It starts with putting people first. I think that's what it really starts with, is people should be the center of the analysis, right? And not the profit-driven whatever it is that's being produced. So if we don't put people first, we're tampering with nature as far as I'm concerned. So I think we need to start thinking about, when we talk about democracy, we talk about people power. And, things can be done. I mean, other countries are doing it. Other countries are doing things that we should be doing, that we can do better. But we're too damn divided to even see that in order to be able to get to the point where we need to get to. So until we address these issues, I think we'll still be talking about what this brother down here is talking about at the end. So
I like that Roberto just said something that triggered a response for me, which is about the youth. And as the youngest person, I'm going to assume on this stage, I want to say something about the importance of youth. And I also want to do a quick shout out to Students for Sensible Drug Policy that are here. I would not be here if it weren't for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I found that organization very early on in my college career. That organization helped me truly understand the depth of my white male privilege and how I was let off when I got busted compared to my friends of color. And I think the youth get brushed aside. I think that a lot of people think that just because we're young, we can't play at the same level as people that are older than us. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. So if you consider yourself a youth, if you consider yourself a youth, and you want to know how you can increase your power in this movement, start by getting involved with Students for Sensible Drug Policy and come find me afterwards. I'm here to tell you that not only can you make change, you can find a space in this movement to not only do what you love, but to help people and to get paid to do it. So I'm here to help you find that path. Come find me afterwards.
Okay, we're going to continue on the theme of youth. What is the future of pediatric, adolescent, young adult psychedelic applications and applications in psychedelic therapies? So, for those who are too young to qualify for studies, what are the thoughts on when it will be available for kids, adolescents, and young adults?
I'll jump back on this. I don't think it's going to happen at the federal level anytime soon. I think this is where, once again, we have opportunities to advance at the state level. I think we can look at medical cannabis. Plenty of medical cannabis laws in Oregon did have allowances for youth to receive access. It was very narrow, but it's not impossible. I think it is something that we have to be incredibly careful about, and I think that there is a timing that is associated with advancing something of that nature. That's not to say that it's any less important than access for any other demographic. But when I say we have to be careful, I mean in our communications to the soccer moms and grandparents demographic that have to vote in order to get some of these things passed at the state level, that's not possible if we start at some of those different levels. But I do think that there is opportunity there. I think that those stories can be just as powerful of healing, if not in some cases more powerful. And I think parents also play a key role in helping empower their children to speak up and share their stories in ways that over time, just like we've seen with veterans, just like we've seen with the end-of-life community, politicians can't afford to get caught on the wrong side of that anymore. I think it's a little bit of a different path for youth, but I do think that some of the same strategies can be applied. We just have to be very careful and intentional about how we apply them.
I think I could jump in here also. I'm pretty sure for the medical side, after FDA approval, there will be requirements to do the research on a younger age population. So I'll just leave that.
And I'll say that some of those grants are being written right now, so those studies may be happening in the next year or two, which would be helpful. Oh, sorry, am I not being loud enough? Some folks are writing grants now to do those studies, and that'll be very interesting. I want to make an interesting point around this. I've been a physician for a little over 10 years. I moved from the bottom 1% to the top 1% very quickly in my life. And maybe only for the past 4 years would I have taken the deal to get access to this treatment versus the cost of the treatment itself. I would have pocketed that $5,000 in an instant for most of my life. And I want to be cautious around this treatment being a panacea because for so much people suffering, money matters. Housing security, food security matters. And so my question mark is, for an adolescent who really needs this treatment, is that the most important thing in their life right now? And I just want to say that out loud as a huge proponent of these treatments, to put that into context of what are we trying to solve here, because someone who's helped young kids throughout my clinical life, the problem usually isn't the fish swimming, it's in the toxic water that they're swimming in. And so I just want to put that out there as...
Yeah, that's great. I want to see if anyone wants to riff on that about, we're talking about psychedelic therapies and so forth, but we're talking about reaching people who have really complex situations. And so when we think about what is appropriate or what is actually needed, what is psychedelic healthcare? Ideas about other things that might be necessary in order for the container of psychedelic healing to actually reach those who are most in need?
I think this is an opportunity to talk a little bit about the parallel path concept that we were talking about in the state reform panel. It's an example of why it's so important that we have both the medical path, the FDA approval path, and this sort of therapeutic policy change state reform path. To speak to specifically the question around youth access, I don't see that, and I'm going to actually disagree with Sam just a little bit on this. I don't see that happening through a policy path until it has gone through a lot of the more scientific research, FDA approval type path. People are just not going to be willing to open this up. We were able to ultimately do that in the cannabis space because there was a lot of science around the effectiveness of cannabis on childhood seizures. And that was the thing that sort of drove people toward understanding how powerful these medicines could be. I think until we have something like that with some deep science behind it, it's going to be very difficult to move the needle on something for people who are not considered sort of age adults. And because of that, I think it's incredibly important that we continue to support the research and the clinical trials and all of that hard science that is going to help bring credibility and realism to that sphere. I think it also is important when we're talking about a therapeutic model that isn't going through the medical system, that we recognize that there are important things that we need to be taking into account that do fall into something of a medical category. And one example of a way to handle that is when we talk about the healing centers or the service centers where people might be coming to get this therapeutic treatment that doesn't involve a diagnosis or necessarily a going through a doctor. That one option is that these centers may employ one medical professional who is responsible for screening everyone coming through to ensure, one, that we are checking on contraindications, making sure we're not putting people at physical risk, and two, to look at what the complexities, the both medical and mental complexities of a person's case mean for who they ought to be matched up with as a facilitator. As some people have pointed out, there are plenty of people who can go through this process in a safe way, either on their own or with just sort of basic facilitation and guiding that helps them get to a deeper place. But there are other people who really do need to have someone with deep training and experience on site, and our goal with these regulated programs is to do as much as we can to match client and facilitator up in a way that meets those sort of medical needs in addition to just the experiential needs.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna move my focus down this way and ask the question a different way. Thank you, Taylor. So with what Reason for Hope is doing and possibly what could be happening with the federal government, my question still along these lines is, what could we be learning and how about how to serve people in underserved communities? So are there provisions in the expanded access money that is being allocated to actually put pilot programs, or what would be the methodology and what would we hope to learn?
Sure. So, and just to take it even a step, to take it even a step further back, so this is really not just a psychedelic research issue. It is an all medical research issue. There is an underrepresentation of minority populations, of lower income populations, and I do think that is an area that we have been very aware of, and think that the funding that we're hoping to get through the expanded access programs is directly meant to increase that representation through providers within those communities. It has to be done from the people who are actually there and are providing care, that are know the patient population, and this form of kind of outside of the clinical trials. One of the benefits to trying to do it this way is that, yeah, the clinical trials are heavily, white, male, higher income, overrepresentation there. And so these programs are, a way that we can go into the communities where people are actually need to be served, provide funding to set up programs, ensuring that people have the right training and the right credentials to be able to provide it. And this is a way that we can start to increase access in those locations, before FDA approval, and collect better long-term data and real-world data on how this is going to work, and to kind of connect it back to what Alex was saying. It's not just youth that has the container matters. It's everyone. We don't really know what the impact is going to be until we start to actually provide treatment and collect that in real world settings for people who are from underserved populations that might not have that support around them.
That might look like perhaps you might have to pay participants to be involved in a study. You may have to have transportation available to be able to tote folks to and back and forth from their communities in order for them to have access to whatever it is the study involves. So there has to be some concessions made in order to get folks to participate in these studies. Perhaps having people who look like them, as credible recruits that are able to work back in the community, reach back in the community again. So there's creative ways to do this, and that's really what irks me, is that there's creative ways to do this, y'all. We just don't do it. So, right? Come on.
Just also to add, because Brett's really the expert, I guess the law also says that for approval, and that there will be some stipulations about access and equity. So it needs to be fundamental, and it needs to be looked at as a criterion for approval as we go about and provide these various treatments.
Thank you so much. Bipartisanship was a theme of the conversation that was briefly touched on. Can more be said about the political sacrifices necessary for psychedelics to proliferate legally? The political sacrifices, what political sacrifices might be necessary for us to move these medicines forward?
That's a fascinating question, in part because of the choice of terms, right? I think one person's sacrifice is another person's compromise, is another person's reasonable accommodation. And none of that is meant to minimize any person's viewpoint of that. Certainly some people are everyone's going to have different sort of red lines about what they feel strongly about. And I think it is important to recognize that there are ideals, there are principles that you hold to incredibly tightly, and there are realities. And everyone has to make their own choice about what mix of those things you're going to adhere to. Some people, political hacks like myself, probably lean a little further toward reality than maybe is the right thing to do. And it's important to have people in your team and collaborators who lean more towards the ideals than you do. But I also think it's important to understand that there is no such thing as a perfect plan. And people working on this in good faith are going to have different opinions about what a good enough plan looks like. So all of that, none of that actually answers the question of what specifically needs to be sacrificed or compromised on. But I think we have to recognize that we are making progress in a world that outside of this room is much less familiar with any of the topics that we've talked about than we are. And it's important to meet people to a certain extent where they are in order to continue moving things forward, and eventually, hopefully, bring people with us closer to that ideal that we might aim for.
My response to that would be that we need to sacrifice the idea that the political is defined by electoral politics that prevails in this country. That is the ideal that has gotten us to the point where you have neoliberal Democrats enabling fascistic Republicans and others. All bets are off at this stage in U.S. history. We've seen it in the Capitol. We see it in people's homes. You see it in the Confederacy living in the hearts and minds of so many in this country. And so I really have little of my time at this stage of my game to dabble in electoral politics without a broad anti-fascist, a broad kind of anti-capitalist psychedelic front. I just don't think we're going to liberal progressive our way out of the crises that we face, whether it's climate change, psychedelics. We need to unleash the radical imagination at this most urgent moment in the lives of your children.
Does anyone else want to speak to the, thank you, Roberto. Anyone else want to speak to the question of bipartisanship and how to move things forward? Okay.
I'm sorry. You wanted to talk about that end of it? Is that what you're saying?
I'm just seeing if there's any other takers.
I mean, as the politician in the room, I guess I'm required to talk about this because I have to deal with it all the time. And it's a really difficult thing to do. This is a weirdly unique issue where I can find some common ground with my Republican colleagues, which is not what I was expecting, to be honest with you. And there's not much common ground because it's not just, actually what we see by the actions in politics is that it's not often really about policy, right? Like it's about cult of personality, it's about group identity, but this is, in this sphere, it's something that clearly helps everybody, and that's why, for me in my bill, having veterans groups and law enforcement officers being out in front, so it's not about we say medicine, but a lot of people call it a drug, right? This is like a recreational, like from the perspective of a lot of people, this is a rich white person's drug. And so instead of it being about that, it becomes about not the substance, but about people. It becomes about human beings. And everyone's suffering. I mean, we're talking about the country and the state of the world. No one's doing great. It doesn't feel great for anyone. And so I think that if there may not be a lot of bipartisanship, but there is at least an acknowledgement that this is really useful for everyone. And for those who have utilized this medicine, obviously the common thing is that it helps feel connected to others as well. So I think that's the common ground where I've found bipartisanship in an environment where it's nearly impossible.
Great, thanks.
I can add a little bit. So I don't think on this issue, what you're sacrificing necessarily isn't always so clear how it's going to break down. And I'm just going to kind of use Pennsylvania as an example. That's where I grew up. My dad still lives there. That's where I lost my mom. That's where the first bill that I wrote to, when I got involved in this process was in Pennsylvania. And it was introduced by a veteran Republican and Democrat. It had about 10 legislators on both sides of the aisle. And I considered that bill much more liberal of a research bill than, or much more progressive of a research bill than what was going on in New York at the time. And part of that was really meant to take it out of the kind of pharma model of research and start to just open up research of natural psilocybin mushrooms and provide funding for group models that might reduce the cost. And what actually held the bill up was not, at least at that point in time, it wasn't Republicans or even any politicians. It was the Department of Health just said that they didn't have the knowledge, the expertise, the resources, and as much as we would like them to fund it, they slow rolled it, and they basically gutted the bill and rewrote it. And I mean, we've seen similar things like that happen just, at the end of the process in California. And, but I just share that to say that it doesn't always fall exactly the way that we might expect in terms of, where the sacrifice comes from.
Can I add one more thing on this too? Honestly, to end on what I hope is somewhat of a hopeful note on this, especially when we're working on ballot initiatives that involve people voting directly as opposed to working through a legislature or something like that. It really does give us an opportunity to look into the way people really are feeling about particular issues. And from my personal experience, I spent a lot of time working in campaign politics, and I got quite burned out of it. We've reached this point, as others have referenced, where people are so dug in on most of their positions that it really doesn't matter what you say. People aren't going to move, and there's such a tiny sliver of sort of movable voters on any given issue that it really just becomes kind of a slog in the trenches. And I stopped doing campaigns in part for that reason. It became very frustrating. And I sort of stumbled into the work with Sam in Oregon and then this work in Colorado and discovered the joy of once again working on an issue where you could actually change people's minds. It's so rare right now, and this is an issue where, because people don't have a lot of entrenched knowledge about it, if you can educate them about the things that we're talking about here in a way that feels relatable to them, you can bring them into this world, this community, in a way that we don't see with almost any other issue. It's not entrenched in party politics yet, and I hope it can stay that way. And it's amazing to see people actually open up and sort of blossom into acceptance of these medicines when they learn just a little bit about the research and about the promise and about the stories. It's an amazing thing that, believe me, you talk to people who work on other political issues, and they are deeply envious of the opportunity that we have here to convince people, talk to people, and persuade them to open up their minds and change their minds about this issue. It's a beautiful thing.
Great, thank you, Taylor. On that note, I'm going to convey 2 questions that are to be asked. I would ask that you ask yourselves and your organizations this question in an ongoing way, and this is coming from multiple different ways from the audience. Who is still being left out of the conversation? How can I and my organization be in solidarity? So I will leave you with those questions. And thank you all so much for being here and sharing your wisdom, for all of your work in the field to support these medicines moving forward. Thank you.